Shalom, giving all the praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, by Hashem Yahushua, by Hashem Rakakodash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of the great millstone who rule and teach well. Peace and safety and much blessings to the Yakim that's pushing his truth at the four corners of the earth and our truth, the sincerity and the diligent Shalom. And title of this lesson basically is going to be um, something like maybe I guess Israel became Greek. Okay, because I was watching Elder Apostle or Ramla. He was teaching, and he said this. He said how did the Israelites become Greek? So I just want to just dive in it, and give my take on it. So really and truly, when you understand, these things through the Spirit and power of the Lord, because the Spirit has to be dealing with you in order for you to understand this Gentile, heathenistic, Helen, all these different things. You have the Spirit of the Lord have to be dealing with you, because there's some Israelites that see this, and we break it down to, that call themselves Israelites. They just can't get over the fact that, the Israelites gonna come looking like the other nations, and that we were scattered throughout the four corners of the earth, okay, through different barriers of captivities. Now, what I'm basically about to go into is that the Greek captivity. All right, you see, doing it was Alexander the Great. Started with Alexander the Great, but then, he parted his kingdoms and, into his four generals. And out of that line of solution, you had Antiochus Epiphanes the Fourth. All right, which, he had a slander and, ill will towards, the nation of Israel. Okay, well, the tribes, let me say that, Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, because that's who was in captivity. All right. So, but the point is that Greek was just a way of life. It wasn't an actual nationality. It was a way of life. Okay. So we about to dive into that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get First Maccabees 1, and I'll start at 41. I was gonna read 10, 10 through 15. Matter of fact, I will, because this is about basically how they became Greek. So this is First Maccabees 1 and 10. It says, the wicked ruler Antiochus Epiphanes, the son of the king Antiochus the third of Syria, was a descendant of one of Alexander's generals. Antiochus Epiphanes had been hostage in Rome before he became king of Syria in the year 137. This is in a GNT, okay? So it says, at that time there appeared in the land of Israel a group of traitorous Jews who had no regard for the law, who had been bad influence on many of our people. They said, Come let us come to terms with the Gentiles, for our refusal to associate with them has brought us nothing but trouble. This proposal appealed to many, and some of them became so enthusiastic about it that they went to the king and received him from permission to follow the Gentile customs. See, this is going into how Israel became Greek, man, because what? They chose that Greek life, because they didn't want to deal with, they wanted to be into the customs of the heathens. So like they wanted to be, following the customs of the heathens, and drawn to learn their works and their practices. Okay, because it said, look, come let us, because, and then at the same time they were forced, but it says some of them became so enthusiastic about it that they went to the king and received him permission to follow, Gentile customs. So, they was being threatened with the sword too. Let me say that. Say they built in Jerusalem a stadium like those in the Greek cities. They had surgery to perform to hide their circumcision, abandoning the holy covenant. Started with associating Gentiles. Salakia. Let me read that over. And they had surgery performed to hide their circumcision, abandoned the holy covenant, started associating with Gentiles and did all sorts of other evil things. All right, so our people, what they chose that Greek way, that Greek way of life. Okay, and started what associating with Gentiles. Okay, and did all types of other wickedness. So this is how they, it's going into how they become Greek, how they became Greek, man, because they really was, under the sword, with that. Because when you go down to verse 41, because they were forced to to leave off their customs. So it says, this is verse 41. It says, and this is in the GNT. Antiochus now issued a decree that all nations in his empire should abandon their own customs and become one people. All the Gentiles, even many of the Israelites, submitted to this decree. They adopted the official pagan religion, offered sacrifices to idols, and no longer observed the Sabbath. So this is what happened to our people, man. They started observing the customs, of the Greeks, man. Okay, they started going into that way of life because Antiochus, this is what he decreed. He said the king also sent messengers with decrees to Jerusalem and all towns of Judea, ordering the people to follow customs that were foreign to the country. He ordered them not to offer burnt offerings, grain offerings, wine offerings in the temple, and commanded them to treat Sabbaths and festivals and ordinary work days. So he really just, profaned the temple, man. Just disregarded the laws of Yahweh by Hashem Yahushai under the order, of Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth. All right, this heathen, which is an Edomite. All right, this is what he decreed throughout his kingdom. Okay, it says, and they were ordered and they were even ordered to defile the temple and the holy things in it. They were commanded to build pagan altars, temples, and shrines to sacrifice pigs and other clean animals. This is how they becoming a Greek, okay? It says, for they were forbidden to circumcise their sons and were required to make themselves ritually unclean in every way they could, so that they would forget the law which the Lord had given through Moses and would disobey all its commands. And the penalty for disobeying the king's decree was death. You know, the king not only issued the same decree throughout his whole empire, but he also appointed officials to supervise the people and command each town in Judea to offer pagan sacrifices. Many of the Jews were ready to forsake the law and to obey these officials. They defiled the land with evil, and their conduct forced all the true Israelites to hide wherever they could. So, right. So, let me make sure. Go down to it. So yeah, verse 50. No, not 51. Where is that? Oh yeah. See, look, when you keep reading, offer sacrifice and mothers who allow their babies. Yeah. This is what they were, like I said, they were threatened under the sword, Salakia. I was reading this right here. Oh yeah, okay, I'm tripping. It says, let me read verse 48. And they were forbidden to circumcise their sons and were required to make themselves ritually unclean in every way they could, so that they would forget the law which the Lord had given through Moses and would disobey all the commandments, that they would forget the law. So this happened for, many generations. So it came to a point to where you had Israelites that just took on the Greek way as I'm a Greek. This is the normal way of living. All right, because what the ancestors before them were threatened with the sword. All right, they were threatened with the sword, and some of them didn't want to deal. Some like it came to the point to where you had Israelites that were like they were called Greek because check this out. Let's go to this. This is how they became Greeks. All right, because like I said, Greek is a way of life. It's not a nationality. You know, they started speaking like Greeks. Doing dressing like them, doing their uh, their rituals, their worship, same worshiping of their idols. Okay, but the 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 Greeks were Edomites. All right, they were Edomites. Like the the representation of the Greeks are Edom. Okay, but Edom is a nationality. Greek is a way of life. Hope that makes sense. Like you got the Americans today. When you think about the Americans, right, you don't think about uh, African Americans. You don't think about, you know, Asian people. When you think about Americans, you think about so-called white people. That's what when say Greeks. You think about so-called white people, but just like you got America, you have, even though you would think of a Edomite when you think of like with a so-called white man or a so-called white woman. When you think about America, you think about so-called white people, but you also have uh, so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans. Here in the Americas, you got Elam here, you got Ishmael here, you got Ammon, Moab here, you got all these different nations here, but they still, if they're born here, which they'll be Hellenized, because they actually originate from like maybe let's say from China, right? But you were born here because of your parents, and you've taken on these traditions. You have now become Hellenized, okay? So you considered an American, right? You're considered an American, but you still you would be a Hellenized Asian, all right? So now with the Israelites, they became Hellenized, you know, through Antiochus Epiphany the Fourth, through the sword, and taking upon different customs that are not of Yahweh Bashem Yahushai, that were of the Greeks though. Okay, so they couldn't even they were being oppressed by the Greeks. All right, so let's see. This is Second Maccabees 2 and no, I'm tripping. First Maccabees. Did I read that? First Maccabees 2 and 23. Mm, just be. Oh yeah, see, look, this is verse 23. Just as he finished speaking, one of the and this is when Matthias was saying like, listen, man, we gonna serve the Lord. We gonna stand 10 toes down for Yahweh by Hashem Yahushai. This is when he was just making that speech, and then it says, just as he finished speaking, one of the men of Modin decided to obey the king's decree and step out in front of everyone to offer pagan sacrifices on altars on the altar that stood there. Right? So he consented. You had this Israelite that consented, and then what you think? Like, and you had a whole bunch of other Israelites that consented. And what you think that they did? They taught their kids, and their kids taught their kids, and their kids taught their kids through generation to generation, to where at this point in time they believe that they are Greeks. Okay? So, watch this. So I hope this makes sense, because this is how they be. This is how Israel became Greeks. All right, and this is history. Okay, but you also had those men that stood for the customs, like Mattathias. You see, the offspring of that goes into the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots, right? Which is different sects of Israelites. Okay, but this is Second Maccabees 4 and oh yeah, this, like I said, this is going into how they became Greeks. All right. It says later, and you see, because the Israelites, which Judah, Benjamin, and Levi were under the oppression of the Greeks. I said that already, but I just want to make sure I hammer the point in. All right. So it says, later, when King Seleucus died and Antiochus, known as Epiphanes, became king, Jason, the brother of Onias, became high priest by corrupt means. So he labored underhand, you know. He wasn't really set there by the Lord, right? He was self-willed, it says. And he went and see the king and offered him 27,000 pounds of silver with 6,000 more pounds to be paid later. Jason also offered him an additional 11,250 pounds of silver for the authority to establish a stadium where young men could train and enroll the people of Jerusalem, Israelites, as citizens of Antioch. You see what I'm saying? So they enrolled them as citizens of Antioch. So I'm like a person would come to America and enroll themselves as a citizen of America, and now, hey, I'm an American. You see what I'm saying? So you had these Israelites that enrolled themselves as citizens of Antioch. And guess what? You want to know something? Did not Paul spend a lot of time in Antioch? Didn't he spend time in Antioch? You see? Because those were, you had Greeks there, calling themselves, Antiochians, you know, Antiochians, and they was calling themselves Greeks, okay? But peep this out. It says, let me see, I think it was 13. Oh, look, check it out. Verse 13, because of the unrivaled wickedness of Jason, that ungodly, illegitimate high priest, the craze for the Greek way of life of foreign customs reached such a point. So, but the point is that look, that it was the Greek way of life. It wasn't really Greeks, but they took on Greek customs. See what I'm saying? So therefore, then if you're doing everything as the Greeks, you're going to call yourself a Greek, okay? And like I said, under the sword, they called themselves Greeks too. This is Second Maccabees 6:6. It was impossible to observe the Sabbath, to celebrate any of the traditional festivals, or even so much as to admit to being a Jew. So if you were oppressed by the Greeks with the consequence of the sword, to be calling yourself anything other than a Greek, you're gonna call yourself what? Greeks. Okay? And that's how they became Greeks, man. Because you had wicked Israelites that was teaching that way of life. Like you got wicked Israelites right now. You know, you got wicked Israelites right now teaching the way of, their oppressors. Okay, consenting to these American ways. All right, selling out you know, to the so-called white man, bro, teaching off doctrine. Okay, so let's see. So now here you are. You got Israelites that are consenting to the Greek way of life and living like Greeks, man. Okay, and they're doing this for what? How many generations and generations and generations to where, hey, look, we're Greeks. They learned the fact that this is a normal thing. All right, and that's why like today you have fraternities. They're going back to like a Greek fashion. The Kappas, the Alphas, the I think it's the Stigmas or Sigmas or something like that. Sigmas, ugly ass, cute. I think maybe I said Q dogs, Thetas, or whatever you want to call them. That's all Greek. That is all Greek. So now, you got these Israelites that's been taught the Greek fashion. Now they calling themselves Greeks, and here we are, right, in the time of the Romans, because that's what this was the time we is in time of Yahushua. See, Yahushua entered Jerusalem. This was the time of the Romans, you know. So now, when we're way in the time of the Romans, here you have John 20 and 12, I mean 12 and 20, it says, and there were certain Greeks among them that came up to worship at the feast. Now, hold up. It says there were certain Greeks among them that came up to worship at the feast. What feast? It's the Passover, man. All right, let me see something. Because you remember, an Israelite man is required of him what? Let me see. See? It says Passover, right? So, read it again. Verse 20. John 12, verse 20. Some Greeks who had come to Jerusalem for the Passover celebration. Now, why were they going to Jerusalem? They was going to Jerusalem. Oh, boy. Dang, I wasn't looking at the keyboard. Let's see. Deuteronomy 16 and 16. Here's the law, right? Here's the law. It says, verse 16, each year every man in Israel must celebrate these three festivals. The festival of unleavened bread, the festival of harvest, and the festival of shelters. Okay? So it says, on each of these occasions, all men must appear before the Lord your power at the place he chooses, but they must not appear before without the gift of him. Watch this. Now look, this is they supposed to go to Jerusalem, right? Ain't they supposed to go to Jerusalem? They say you must appear where? 3 times a year. You shall appear all the male. 3 times a year shall all thy male appear before the Lord in thy power in the place which he shall chooses, right? And which is that? That's Jerusalem, right? So, but look, let's go back to John. It says some Greeks who had come to Jerusalem for the Passover celebration, right? So why was these Greeks going? Because they were command. It was a law, right? Because you had Israelites that grew up, speaking, Greek, speaking, knowing how to speak Greek, but practicing, the law, statutes, and commandments, man. Okay. And you also had those Hellenized Jews, all right, which would, let's see. Hellenistic. Am I saying it like that? Hellenistic. Right? It says Hellenistic of or pertaining to Greece and its culture from Hellene, ancient Greek, right? Let me see. One who uses Greek language, though not a Greek. All right? Though not a Greek. Uses Greek language, though not a Greek. What I was going to. Okay, so look, let's go to Acts 6 and 1. It says, Acts 6 and 1, and it says, in those days when the number of the disciples were multiplied, there arose a murmuring of the Grecians, right, against the Hebrews because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration. Let's see what they got right there. Against the Grecians, right? That's what we just looked up. Hellenistes, right? Hellenists, right? That's what we looked that word up right here. Hellenist, one who imitates the manners or customs or worship the Greeks and use Greek tongue. used in the New Testament of Jews born in foreign lands speaking Greek. Okay? Speaking Greek. Israelites, Jews. They said that what? Speaking Greek. So that's why they were considered Greeks. You know, especially by the circumcision. The circumcision, they stood 10 toes down. To for the law, statutes, and commandments and practices. All right, the keeping of the temple. So you born outside the land. Are you speaking Greek? Are you look? You looking a certain way. They wasn't. Nah, they were. That's why they was against the uncircumcision. But these were Israelite foreigners that was that was the offspring of those who okay uh, that kept the king's customs and did and kept the Greekish way of life. So you had Israelites that knew who they was, you know, but just wasn't partaking in the custom. See, cause check this out. When we read John, right? We read John 20. No, it's 12 and 20. John 12 and 20. It says, and then there were certain Greeks among them that came up to worship to the feast. Now these Greeks are what? Keeping the feast, right? Now when you go to Acts 16, check this out. And there came and then came he to Derbia and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timotheus, the son of a certain woman, which was a Jewish, right? Was a Jewess and believed, but his father was a Greek. Now hold up, man. You know, check this out. It was a certain woman, right? Which was a Jewess. Right? So let's go. Salaki. So a Jewish, so she not Jewish. Ish is the suffix, but she was a Jew, right? She was an Israelite belonging to the Jewish nation, Jewish respect to birth and origin. So she knew the law, statutes, and commandments. She knew it was an abomination to be with him of another nation, right? A heathenistic nation. So, but it says that his father was a Greek. Now, was it saying that his father was uh, uh, a Edomite or a Moabite or a Ishmaelite? No, it's not saying that. It's saying he was a Greek. Why? Because he chose the Greekish fashion. Okay, like he wasn't serving Yahweh by Hashem Yahweh Shai, man. Right? It just said he was a Greek. Okay. Helene. Right? Greek either by nationality, whether a native in the mainland or of the Greek islands or colonies. In a wider sense, the name embraces all nations, not Jews, that made the language, customs, and learning of Greeks their own. The primary reference is to a different religion. No, you see, you had Israelites that took up on the Greek fashion. You had Israelites that took up on, you know, that language and customs, okay, and were called Greek. See, like I said, she was a Jewess, so she knew she couldn't be with no other man, outside, the nation of Israel. So, but look, it called him a Greek because he took upon, those customs and practices. Okay. So this is why they were called Greek. This is how they turned into Greeks. Through idolatry and the worshiping of that way of life. You know. So yeah, like I said, they was even calling themselves Antioch. Paul was in Antioch. you know. So, Lord willing, you are edified. Shalom.